what we're seeing in the mainstream media and on mainstream social media is very much curated by government agencies. In the United States of America, this is going on right now. They don't even seem to be concerned about it. They're continuing to hold their meetings. They're bragging about it all the time.
Welcome to the Wiggin Sessions. I'm Addison Wiggin. Today I have with me my good friend, Jeffrey Tucker. We have a lot to catch up on. We haven't spoken for a little bit. In the time that we used to work together, Jeffrey was an editor of Laissez Faire newsletter that we published for a number of years and used to camp out in my office and talk about Bitcoin a lot. We're going to get to Bitcoin at one point today. But in the interim, since I have spent a lot of time with Jeffrey, he has founded and is now the president of the Brownstone Institute. And I actually got interested in talking to you, Jeffrey. First of all, welcome. Thank you for coming back on the Wiggin Sessions.
Sure.
I got interested in an article that you wrote because it was tweeted out by Robert Kennedy Jr. on his campaign tweet. And he referenced an article that you had written about the Great Barrington Declaration. So there's a couple things we need to unpack before we can really talk about what that means. First, you're the founder of the Brownstone Institute. I'd like you to explain what that is and what your objective is in publishing the articles that you publish. There's a lot of great material that I've been consuming, but I'd like to talk about the founding of it, and then also the Great Barrington Declaration, which you yourself have been covering in the Brownstone Institute pieces that you've been writing, and also on Epoch Times. Well, so why don't we get started? I'll kind of turn it over to you for a little bit because you can bring me up to speed. I'm really interested to see what you've been up to.
Well, one of the things you really trained me to do when I was working for you at Laissez Faire was to explore the kinds of ideas that are not being covered in the mainstream media, which is a bit of your conviction that if it's being covered in the mainstream media, it may not be worth that very much, and that the really important big ideas are found elsewhere. And so I wanted to start an institute that was really devoted to covering the things that are not being covered elsewhere. And I noticed after the pandemic response that it was to my mind, an utterly ridiculous and dangerous and destructive policy from the beginning all the way through, whether we're talking about the lockdowns or the masking or the vaccine mandates or the censorship that went along with it. There's so many things that are associated with that. You know, the decline in prosperity, the decline in opportunity, the decline in lifespans, the rise in suicides. I mean, it's all connected. So I started a Brownstone just to have a venue for dissident writers to write about these really important topics: the cartelization of medicine, the rise of the security state, the censorship-industrial complex, all these things that have been changed. Our lives have changed so much in 4 years. And I wanted something that would be devoted to covering that. And so that's what we do. I've got about 200 writers and several cells of working groups. Some working groups are focused on pandemic planning, others on the censorship problem, others on the cartelization of medicine and medical freedom issues. And we also cover economics. So it's a little bit of everything, but I did it because, well, it's a nonprofit organization. I mean, you've somehow in your career managed to do this on a for-profit basis, which is great. But I decided to go nonprofit, and we've gotten a lot of support from donors, and it seems to be thriving. We're competing with the big boys now after just 2.5 years of existence. So
just even the reach that you've managed to get through the number of different writers that you are publishing in a very real sense, especially after the pandemic, alternative news rivals it as far as subjects that are covered, and also the reach that you're able to attain rivals mainstream media. You don't follow the narrative. And that's part of what I want to talk to you about today, because I think the Great Barrington Declaration is a good entree into that discussion of the attempt to control the narrative, mostly over the pandemic, but then we see it going into play with support of the Ukraine war, and even the way that we talk about the Federal Reserve. There's a lot of things that are, like, if you watch mainstream network news, for example, or if you read mainstream, I'm even talking about like Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal, the narrative is very defined across those platforms. And you can almost just read one and replace it with the other. They all kind of say the same. But there is alternatives ways of looking at things. And historically in the newsletter business, we've always looked for stories that aren't getting told, but also we have the luxury in a way of going deeper and trying to understand things, trends that are in place, or influences on history, or the upcoming election is a big thing. There's a lot more going on than what you get from the polls and surveys that you see bandied about. So let's start with the Great Barrington Declaration, because I thought that was really important. And now it's getting picked up. It was picked up by Kennedy, who's running for president.
Yeah. So that was in October of 2020. And it was all, so what you remember what happened? It was March 2020. There's lockdowns everywhere. And then there was masks, and there's a vaccine on the way. And you couldn't really get a diversity of opinion out there. And I got in contact with Martin Kulldorff at Harvard, who seemed to be, he's from Sweden. And he was posting things on LinkedIn that weren't exactly consistent with the prevailing narrative. You know, remember those days, you turn on your television, there's all these big shot scientists that you previously never heard of, and they're telling you to comply, don't disagree, just go along with everything, douse yourself with hand sanitizer, and otherwise hide in your home. And it was just the New York Times saying the same thing. It just got crazy. And so I invited Kulldorff, and we got together, and he said, well, listen, let me get a couple of other friends, Jay Bhattacharya and Sunetra Gupta from the Oxford, and we'll hold a little seminar on epidemiology for journalists. I mean, this so naive, right? So naive, thinking that all we had to do was bring some experts in, teach the journalists some basic truths, and then they would write those truths in the newspapers. I mean, that's what we really believed. I mean, God, I can't even recreate my old self that believes that that was possible. So I said, okay. And then I started writing invitations to New York Times reporters, Wall Street Journal reporters, you know, Atlantic, you know, every important reporter on the COVID issue at the time, and inviting them to sit at the feet of these great experts from Harvard, Stanford, and Oxford. So the world's three greatest epidemiologists will teach you about infectious disease. Well, they didn't come. I don't need to tell you the conclusion. They didn't show up. And hardly any of them even answered my email, but mostly they just dismissed it. And I thought, well, this is strange. Why aren't they willing to learn things? I didn't realize that there was already a narrative in place, and they weren't interested in learning broader truths, you know? And so when we held the event, I had to kind of pack it with just friends. I just grabbed various people, you know, John Tamney from Real Clear Markets, and a couple of other people. I mean, there's not that many people, and warm bodies wherever I could find them. Well, the event itself was a bit of a bust for that reason. So then they said, well, why don't we put out a sort of open letter on the topic? And I said, well, open letter is a little condescending, so why don't we change it to a declaration? They named it after the town we met in. And then my webmaster at the time, who's Brownstone webmaster now, stayed up all night making a website, and we released it. We bought our own domain, and we built the website and just released it. And it was like, I don't know, Addison, I can't even begin to describe it. It was like the ceiling just fell in. It was like the end of the world, you know? Everybody was against it. And we found out later that the head of the National Institutes of Health had issued a call, widespread call for a quick and devastating takedown of this document. This document didn't say anything other than everybody should just go back to normal. And we should, you know, if you're vulnerable to COVID, you should, you know, be careful. That was basically the upshot of the document. It wasn't that big a deal. But it's like we had destroyed the beast, you know, or I don't understand. We didn't realize at the time the national security state had put a very strong priority on everybody complying with these COVID edicts. And so I was introduced into the new world, you know, with the controlled information flows, orthodoxies imposed from above. The national security state working very closely with political powers and media and social media, all to kind of, curate and control the public mind. I found out about all this stuff in real time. It may be dark and cynical. I'm not the same man I used to be after watching all this whole thing unfold. It was a real revelation. Of course, we continue to get revelations that this is the way opinion is manufactured in this country now. Maybe it started then. Maybe it started back in 2016. I'm not sure when it started, but it is the way information is controlled. So the Washington Post just yesterday ran an article, I don't know if you read it, that said the White House is working very carefully and closely with social media companies and other media companies to make sure that people are saying the right thing about the economy right now, to make sure that they're not saying we're in a recession or a silent depression or that incomes are going down, but rather say we're in the area of unprecedented opportunity and Biden administration is responsible for it. So this whole desire to control public opinion, control your mind, goes back. I experienced it with the Great Barrington Declaration, but now it's bleeding into everything else. As you said, it's been the Ukraine, even the Israeli-Gaza thing, but now just on what the inflation rate is, and now we can't talk about anything without having it being controlled and filtered by all these big channels, which my friends and I call the Censorship-Industrial Complex, right? That's what it is.
Yeah. Since publishing the Declaration, and then this article that Robert Kennedy references, you were talking about the story of publishing the Declaration, the Declaration that wasn't supposed to happen. What has been your experience since getting it out there? I know that you've been contacted by people who are trying to correct your way of thinking.
Yeah.
But then once it's out on the internet, then people like me, like I read it and I'm like, yeah, I agree with what you've been writing about. What has been the experience of, or your experience interacting with people who are seeing an alternate way of viewing things for the first time? Because I think that there's been a sort of wellspring of people going, wait, there's something not quite right about all of this, and here's an example.
Yeah, that is so true. People are being persuaded and gradually coming around. Back 3.5 years ago, I felt very alone. I don't feel that way anymore, but the attacks are increasing. What's really interesting is the use of sock puppets online, and I've noticed that there's just about a half dozen accounts that are constantly, like daily, even hourly, tweeting against me and calling me all kinds of names and saying terrible things about me. I didn't realize until yesterday with Matt Taibbi's and Michael Schellenberger's report that this whole thing was there's an actual organization set up that works very closely with the Department of Homeland Security called the Cyber Threat Information League, something like that. And they use what they call offensive tactics. They establish sock puppets with credentials after the name MD, PhD, that sort of thing, even though you can't find out who they are. And they assign them to particular individuals who are political dissidents. And I've been assigned half a dozen people that just attack me all the time. It's just crazy. I realize this now. I mean, it's really coming into view. I used to be mystified by this. Like, doesn't this guy have anything better to do with his life than sit around attacking people? I'm only now realizing, he's assigned to attack me. That's his job,
Well, that's kind of interesting. I'm glad you brought up Schellenberger and Taibbi because I've been following their effort. I think Schellenberger, at least, I'm not sure about Taibbi, has testified before Congress on censorship and the case that's making its way through the courts right now, trying to prevent the Biden administration from contacting social media organizations directly. And there have been a number of injunctions as the case makes it through the court, and Schellenberger has been doing a great job of following that. Have you been in touch with him directly?
Yeah, we have a censorship working group.
That's enough.
Yeah, well, we're very close to all these people, actually, and supporting all sorts of lawsuits, like the lawsuit against the quarantine camps in New York, and then supporting this Missouri Biden lawsuit that's going to the Supreme Court. That raises fundamental questions, First Amendment questions, about whether or not the government can really outsource its censorship to these third parties, and whether, it still seems like censorship. And we have now tens of thousands of pages of proof that that's exactly what they've been doing. And now we have the Washington Post openly admitting it, as of yesterday, that the White House is working closely with social media companies to get them to throttle the accounts of saying the economy is in bad shape. If you say that, you're going to be throttled, and that's at the behest of the White House. Okay, that's the violation of the First Amendment, and the Supreme Court is taking up the case. Now, the injunction is on hold right now for another few months. They may be renewed, maybe it won't be, but the case will be heard sometime in the next 2 or 3 years. But Addison, here's what strikes me as strange about this. There's every reason to believe that the Supreme Court is going to say you can't do this anymore. But that's not slowing them down. They keep doing it. I mean, even now, you get stuff deleted by YouTube, every day. LinkedIn is deleting posts and blocking people. I hear reports daily about this. So this cartel, this information cartel, this machinery of compulsion that's out there working at behest of government agencies is still, they're not intimidated by these court cases at all. It's like they're not paying any attention to them. They're just continuing on with their work every day. So as a result, what we're seeing in the mainstream media and on mainstream social media is very much curated by government agencies. In the United States of America, this is going on right now. And they're not even, they don't even seem to be concerned about it. They're continuing to hold their meetings. They're bragging about it all the time. I mean, freedom is in a great deal of trouble if you can't even depend on something basic like the First Amendment anymore. But that's sort of where we are.
But you did say that you think that the Supreme Court is going to say you can't do that. You don't think that's going to slow them down either? But they'll just find another way. I do find their argument very interesting. The reason why it's making its way through the courts, because their argument is you can't prevent us from reaching out directly to social media companies because the government itself has First Amendment rights. And that's they're expressing their opinion by trying to control the narrative. And if you suppress that, then you're suppressing the government's right to free speech.
Yeah.
But they're actually turning it on its head in a very Orwellian way. They're basically saying controlling the narrative is free speech.
Yeah.
And that's what's going to be heard by the court.
Yeah. I'm guessing the Supreme Court's not going to buy this hullabaloo, and they're going to side with the plaintiffs. But is it enforceable? And then, and what are going to be the carve-outs that allow it to continue? Because we know this has been going on for decades. I mean, probably since World War II. So they're not probably going to change fundamentally. And you have all these institutions, individuals, and academics and media figures that are used to this. I mean, we know this from our realm is economics, right? We know how economics is reported. Whatever the BLS says is true. Whatever the Census Department says is true. Whatever the Social Security Administration says is true. And they write the stories and they appear the day of the data releases. So the media just goes along with government anyway. So it may not change much, but it'd be at least nice to get some clarity on what government can and cannot do. My guess is it's going to be a 5-4 decision in our favor. But is that going to fix it? I'm not entirely sure. The Supreme Court doesn't have an army, as we know.
What exactly does the Declaration say? Just kind of in your own words, what Robert Kennedy had tweeted is it's a great article on the hijacking of science and the bullying of scientists who dare resist the normative, dominant political narrative. And then he wrote, before introducing the Declaration itself, 3 years later, the mainstream is beginning to accept what the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration said in 2020 and were pilloried for saying. So this is Kennedy saying it, but he also is the target. I did a Wiggin Sessions, one of these, interviewing Jeff Hayes, who directed the documentary on Kennedy's book, The Real Anthony Fauci. Yeah. And you mentioned people getting censored on YouTube. It was the first, it's not the only one of the Wiggin Sessions that I put out there, but it was taken down within 8 hours of me putting it up.
Wow.
And all I did was interview the director of the documentary about a book. And I haven't spoken to Robert Kennedy directly myself, but they didn't even want coverage of the documentary out there. And now here he is, like, talking about the same stuff. He's quote unquote an anti-vaxxer, and he's citing the effort to prevent scientists from being bullied and cajoled into going along with the narrative. I guess that's a long description of, I've just been following this story, and it's interesting to me that there is an awareness that the bullying is going on, that the narrative is being controlled, that, like, all of those things are happening, but it still doesn't pierce the sort of the mainstream point of view on anything.
Right. So the Great Barrington Declaration didn't say anything that anybody didn't agree with already from early February 2020. That's just that the line changed. My guess is it changed around February 26th or 27th when the New York Times started calling for lockdowns and started raising panic about everything. And then everything changed. The World Health Organization said we should follow China and do exactly what China did with the lockdowns, and that'll make the virus go away. And so suddenly it was like this big shift. And you're asking a really interesting question, because I'm not even sure I understand the answer to it. Like, how did it change so rapidly? You know, between, say, February 10th, when 800 epidemiologists and public health officials associated with Yale University sent out a document that was very much like the Great Barrington Declaration. Don't lock people down, don't impose travel restrictions, don't quarantine people who are not sick, and so on and so on. They said all this stuff. On February 10th, 800 people signed it. And then, like, 20 days later, everything changed. And I assume this has something to do with edicts from Fauci, the NIH, but it's so crazy that it all just flipped on a dime, so that 6 months later, when the Great Barrington Declaration came out, repeated some of the same things that were being said by mainstream public health back in early February of 2020, it was considered to be verboten and evil and heretical and terrible and dangerous and so on, and had to be suppressed. So something happened. And you recall in those days from March 2020 that Trump himself changed. On March 9th, he was sending out tweets saying, look, this is going to be a flu. People die of the flu. You know, everybody should just relax. By March 11th, he was promising a whole of government response. By March 13th, he issued the national emergency legislation that transferred power of pandemic management over to the National Security Council. That was March 13th. March 16th, he sent out the edict that all public and private and venues where people gather should be closed. So that's a really dramatic change between March 9th and March 13th. So who got to him and how? You know, I don't know. And we know that he grew a little bit incredulous of the whole response sometime over the next 2 months. And then 2 months later, he was done, you know, with the whole lockdown thing. But a lot of Brownstone's work is to dig into exactly what happened. And we still don't know. And the problem is, Addison, that a lot of this information is classified. We can't get access to it. We don't have, I mean, even FOIA requests come back all blanked out. So something happened. We just don't know what it was entirely.
Yeah, the weird thing to me is that it's kind of like a blueprint for controlling whatever narrative they want to talk about. You're talking about now. I've been following the effort by the Biden administration to sell. They even use that word, sell Bidenomics, as, you know, this great economic revival. And even the people that are writing about it are asking the question, well, what is it? Like, what does it do? What is Bidenomics? And I know that every administration wants to tout their economic record, but I don't understand how they can, like, the data doesn't support anything that they're talking about.
Right.
And yet they just keep repeating it. And then we have this blueprint for bullying journalists into going along with the narrative. That's
right.
It's like perplexing to me. Like I don't really understand it. I argue with people that are like, oh yeah, the deep state and the government is controlling everything, and I argue with people like that all the time because I'm like, it can't be that. It can't. There has to be some kind of willingness to go along with the whole charade.
Yeah,
and that's the problem. What are we fooling ourselves over?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And you're right that it mutates out of infectious disease and goes to foreign policy. Now it's embedded itself in economics. Sometimes you think you're crazy. Like in the last week, all the reporters have decided to say that inflation has subsided. I don't entirely know what the word subsided means. Like, I'm not sure what that word means, actually. Like, I look it up. You have a sense that it means rested, or I don't know what subside means. But you can look up right now.
It's because the word inflation didn't take on. Like, people are like, that's too complicated. I don't understand that. But subsided just not growing as fast as it was, right?
Okay. Yeah, I guess. I guess that's what it means. I don't know, but they're saying inflation subsided, so stop talking about it. Subsided. So I went to the Federal Reserve, St. Louis, as we all do, the Fed statistics, and looked up sticky price inflation, which is the CPI minus the volatile categories of food and energy, and it's running 5.6%. Okay, that's higher than it's been in 32 years. So 5.6% is really, really high. That's an extreme by any standard. It's like a third of a century, So that's not subsided. That's still really intense, and that's a data you can look at.
I was just looking at this is from David Stockman. He was the head accountant for Reagan a long time ago, and now he's kind of like a libertarian gadfly, right? He's always poking any policy the government comes up with. But he published this morning, which I thought was interesting. He quoted from Karine Jean-Pierre, who is Biden's speaker right now. She's the one that gives the press conferences. And she's basically berating people, saying prices are going down. Families are seeing lower prices on everyday items from gas to groceries. And then Stockman is asking, well, how can that be when, if you just go back to 2021, household rents have gone up 18%, grocery items have gone up 20%, airfares have gone up 20%, used cars have gone up 23%, electric utilities, like everyday utilities, have gone up 24%, vehicle maintenance and repair has gone up 27%, and gasoline has gone up 45%. Those are all in the last 2 years while they're saying prices are going down. It makes no sense to me.
And then there's also the problem of health insurance. Apparently that has just gone through the roof. But the CPI itself lists in the most recent report says year over year, health insurance costs are down 43%, which is a major reason why the overall CPI was dragged down. So, do you know anybody whose health insurance costs have gone down 43%? I mean, it's not even believable anymore. And that's the other thing I've noticed. I don't know if Stockman writes about this, but I'm obsessed with it. The way in which the data reporting agencies have become so politicized, and you can particularly see it in the jobs reports. I think it was not this month, but last, they came out with some big announcement that 350,000 new jobs are created. You dig into the data, it turns out there's an overall loss of like 150,000 full-time jobs. And then an increase of like 200,000 part-time jobs, and multi-job holders was through the roof. So you'd think that would be, in other words, we lost more full-time jobs 2 months ago in 1 month period than we had since the lockdowns in March 2020. You'd think that would be the headline, but it was entirely buried in the press release. So in our lifetimes, Addison, I don't think, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think that the data agencies have been as politicized as they've become under Biden. So now you can't even trust their press releases anymore. That wasn't true in the past. They're always sort of independent of the political people. But now you've got the Biden administration mixing it up in the way the press releases are crafted. And those are repeated by the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. So it makes you crazy. And there are like a handful of us even looking at this stuff.
So I'm curious though, like with the Great Barrington Declaration, that gets out there on the internet. You write about it, I write about it, and then it gets tweeted about. And there, there's like a minority of writers who are concerned about these sort of things. We mentioned Schellenberger and Taibbi.
Yeah.
They're very active in the free speech space. It just feels to me like at some point the credibility of the system will be completely eroded.
Seems like it.
Which is a danger unto itself. If
Yes.
if we can't trust the government anymore, then we don't trust the government. Nobody trusts the government anyway. The Congress approval rating is like 7% right now. Well,
Yeah.
if you believe the polls.
Yeah.
I mean,
right.
those polls are probably skewed to the upside at this
Probably.
point. But
Right. This isn't all good news, right? I mean, like, I think the libertarian in me used to believe, oh, wouldn't it be great if nobody believed the government? Okay, that sounds great. But the problem is that the loss of trust is pervasive. It's not just focused on the government, it's the media, it's the big corporations, it's the idea of truth itself is under question now. So we're entering into a period of such a loss of trust. It's pervasive across the board. Everything. Nobody believes anything or anybody anymore. And I'm not sure that's healthy for a democracy. I mean, it can't be healthy. This is really dangerous, actually. Do you just presume that everybody's lying about everything all the time? I mean, how's that good for a civilization? That's not good. That's terrible.
yeah, so what do you think the end game of all that is? What role does the internet play in the way that we can communicate quickly now across many different media? We can have knee-jerk reactions to any data point or political position or whatever, and it just flies around, and there's no real consensus over what's true. It's not like what's the end game of all that?
You and I lived through 1989 and 1990. I think, when we saw these governments just fall apart and whole societies just collapse. The organizational structure of 50 years, 70 years just kind of fell apart. The Soviet Union fell into, the same with Eastern Europe. And we looked at that and we kind of otherized it and said, oh, that's how totalitarian socialist societies fell apart. That now we know. And it was interesting to watch and very instructive. But one of the things we didn't consider at that time was that the same kind of forces that led to that would also someday affect industrialized Western democracies. And I guess I would just simply say that we don't know yet what that looks like. What does it mean? What is the end game when the loss of trust is throughout the entire society, when nobody believes anything anymore, when nobody trusts the government, when the consensus is really withdrawn from the ruling class that are running everything on behalf of the masses of people? Does that trigger something? And if it does, what is that? Is it authoritarian government? Is it a new form of liberty? We just don't know. But I think we're seeing that, and we're starting to see these pressure points arrive. In the Netherlands, they threw out the old government that was ruining all the farmers, and they've brought a new government in. It's going to be interesting to see whether that's effective. In Argentina, I'm sure, I think you and I have many mutual friends in Argentina. They elected this new guy who's quite a radical, but is he going to accomplish the goal? Can we soft land this sort of Western totalitarian, industrialized, democratic, inflationary collapse? Can we soft land that into a new liberty?
Logan, I love Milei's slogan. Javier Milei is who you're talking about.
Yeah.
His slogan was, "For liberty, damn it."
Yeah, he's great. Yeah, but we'll see. My guess is that, so what you're talking about here is, can political forces defeat the administrative state? Is there a mechanism in place that really permits that? For one guy to get elected and dismantle a ruling class bureaucracy that sees control of society and controls its information, the central bank, is that really going to work? We're gonna see. My best guess is that it's going to be a long time before we see the final unraveling of all this stuff. I don't see any real political figures in the U.S. that are in a position really to do that. I think RFK would be a very interesting guy, but I don't know. It's the beast is so big. It seems implausible. You could just elect the right guy, and everything's going to take care of itself. So we're looking at a collapse on a different level.
Yeah, that's what Trump had promised in 2016. He was going to drain the swamp. But ended up spending more money. I mean, that's been my career. Is I tie all of this back to the sort of the benefit that the U.S. has because we print the world reserve currency, and that gives us a ton of latitude to spend more than we take in tax receipts or in our ability to manage the bond market, to borrow the money that we need to keep the government going. And it seems like even with Trump, his bravado going into office that he was going to drain the swamp and do all that, he ended up changing the things that we spent on.
Yeah,
he didn't really drain the swamp at all. He just built a few dams and made the swamp water go in different directions.
Yeah,
and in many ways increased the size of the swamp.
He did, and
I don't know. And politically, there's a huge amount of support for Trump because his bravado and the way he just attacks people when they disagree with him. It's hard to ever figure out what he's actually talking about. But even the momentum that he had in 2016, even in 2020, 73 million people still support the idea of draining the swamp. Yeah. And we're going to see that again next year. 2024 is going to be another year where it's the everyman versus the administrative state. And that was Milei down in Argentina. That was his whole thing. He carried around a chainsaw and he said he was just going to cut the roots of the government. I don't know. All of these strains, they seem to end in violence to me. Like, I don't know where any of this is going.
But it seems like it can't be good. And then you have the other problem that many of my friends, let me say, I knew a lot of people who went to work for Trump last time. Some of them out of Ivy League universities, full professors and whatever. And after they left the Trump administration in 2020, they could not get their jobs back. They were just blackballed by all universities and by all media outlets. And, part of what...
Because of association with Trump?
Yeah, because of their association with Trump. So they punished all the people who went to work for Trump. Most of those people, they had to go to work for Trump-affiliated think tanks like the America First Foundation, that kind of stuff, because they couldn't get jobs otherwise. And part of what Brownstone is doing is we're taking on these people, giving them sanctuary, at least in the meantime. I mean, good people like FDA officials who took jobs at the FDA and then couldn't get, like a friend of mine was number 3 at the FDA, left his job at Yale, full professor of pharmacology, became number 3 at FDA. After Trump left office, he couldn't even get a job at a university, ended up working for CVS back in his mother's hometown. I mean, that's how bad it is, So it's a question now, who's going to go to work for Trump, given that that's where you're going to end up? Who's going to be willing to give up their entire life and career to go to work for him this time? Not too many. I mean, some, but it's not going to be the best of the best. Maybe we don't want the best of the best. Maybe this isn't going to matter. But if you want a career in the future, you cannot go to work for the Trump administration. It's just going to have a grave difficulty attracting anybody of any competence whatsoever. It's a very interesting problem.
The way that you're saying that, though, you're assuming that people would not want to work for the administration if he got elected. I mean, the election is a year away.
Yeah.
And just the way politics works in this country, the Democrats are not going to give up easy, even if the popular vote is against them. They're not going to give up power.
I assume that's right.
This is a digression from what I wanted to talk to you about, but I'm sure you have many opinions on this. So I'm going to ask you anyway. I've been looking at the Cloward Piven strategy, the pivot that they wrote about in the 60s. We had a similar tumultuous period in the 60s where there was a lot of social justice, civil rights movement was going on. There was a lot of marches in the streets, and one of them ended in a riot in Watts in 1965. It was very famous, the Watts race riots. And in response to that, two sociologists from Columbia, Cloward and Piven, wrote a strategy that was published, I think, in The Nation, and it articulated a system for overwhelming the bureaucratic state in order to effect social change. And it's been followed by like Black Lives Movement is part of it, defund the police. Piven herself, Frances Fox Piven, was one of the authors of the strategy. Was the organizer, one of the organizers of Occupy Wall Street just in 2016. Like there's this whole strain of ideology that are advocates overwhelming the system and using that as a way, like if the government can't pay for itself anymore, if it can't meet the promises that it makes, then it loses credibility, and that opens the door for it. Really, what it does open the door for is something you alluded to, is authoritarianism. Someone to come in and be like, it's utter chaos, I'm going to fix it. And then you get demagogues that come in and sort of pick up the pieces, and what you have on the other side is a bunch of people that are afraid, they're losing their jobs, they're economic anxiety, there's a difficulty in just functioning of the economy. That all happened during the pandemic. That's why I was saying it's kind of like a blueprint for what we're going to experience moving forward. That to me seems like the end game is that you have these popular movements that overwhelm the system, and then the only solution at that point is strongmen. And I think Trump played that role in 2016. I don't know if he's going to be as strong in 2024. But that's where this leads, in my opinion. I don't know if you have any.
I watched this movie, which is actually a good movie. It's not great, but it's good, called Napoleon. Ridley Scott's Napoleon.
Yep, that's on.
Yeah, and it's worth watching, if only because Americans don't know anything about European history. After the French Revolution, we just we're woefully ignorant of this stuff. So it's good. But that's essentially the story, right? You had the French Revolution. They didn't really have an experience of a tactile form of operational liberty like we had in America. After our revolution, we were just trying to get rid of the annoying exogenous force of King George, and then we went back to our business of being free individuals, right? In France, they got rid of all the church and the state and everything that was associated with it. Everything revolved around the church and the state and the monarchy. They get swept that away, and there wasn't anything else except victorious battles, which Napoleon had won a few. And so next thing you know, he's emperor, So that's why the American and French revolutions turned out to be different. So it's a real question. If the whole system collapses today, where are we going to end up? Most likely, I think you're right. We're going to end up with a Napoleonic kind of situation. Who's our Napoleon? Is it Trump? Is it Newsom? I don't know. One of the two, I suppose. But where is our experience with real lived liberty anymore? We've got a whole generation under 30 that doesn't even know what it means to be free and independent anymore. When I went to school, I left home at the age of 17, I never asked another dime from my parents. I worked, was able to work my way through school, full-time jobs, paid for the school, paid for the books, paid for everything, paid for my apartment, and worked all the time. And it's what shaped me. But kids these days, it's no longer true. I was just yesterday. It was some guy was moving out of my apartment unit here, and I said, "Hey, you're leaving." I'm sorry about that noise. Let me see if I can turn it off. I said, "Hey, why are you leaving?" And he said, "Well, I'm going to save money." I said, "Oh yeah, where are you moving?" He goes, "The same place everybody's moving, home with mom and dad." This kid is like 30.
Yeah.
He's moving home with mom and dad, even though he's got a full-time job. He's got $200,000 of student loans, and he can't afford anymore. He's probably making 70K, and he can't afford to live. So he has to move home. It's a completely different generation. Everybody under 30 has got this problem. Not to mention substance abuse and God knows what else. But we don't have that kind of experience with independent living and liberty. We don't know what it feels like and what it looks like anymore. This is my major worry about the future of this country.
Yeah, I maintain to my own kids that there was a sea change, and you kind of alluded to it earlier in this conversation. There was a sea change that happened in the pandemic. My youngest daughter is now 17. So she was 14, 15 when the pandemic was going on, the lockdowns. And so for her, that was just in just a kind of bizarre way. That was the way life was. Like she didn't really have an experience of life before. All the stuff that we're talking about today, like the control of the narrative and all that kind of stuff. We grew up in, especially like when you and I were working together for years, we had this idea that we could express our opinions, and that there was a way to manage your finances. We publish financial advice, so there's a way to like navigate your way through any kind of economic downturn or bear market in the stock market. We've been writing and talking about that for 20 years, but something happened in the pandemic where it's difficult to conceive of strategies that get you out of it now. And I try to express that to my kids that are like, "Why are you always talking about the pandemic? Like it's over. We don't have that anymore." But there is a material difference between the way we lived in 2019 and the way we live today.
Yeah, I agree with that. And Addison, a lot of it comes down to the stimulus payments. That was weird. It must have been strange for you. It was certainly strange for me because we had lockdowns and everybody's staying at home. And then out of nowhere, for the first time in our lifetimes, the government started showering everybody with money. Like, wait, the government doesn't give money. We give the government money. Why is all this money coming to us? And they dropped it into our bank accounts. Oh, here's $3,000. Oh, here's $8,000. Oh, here's $10,000. Here's $15,000. You got a business? Oh, here's my business. Oh, here's $50,000. Wow, this is really a different kind of government than the one I ever expected. And this went on for, 12 months, maybe 14 months. And then the inflation kicked in and stole all the money back in the form of robbing our purchasing power, exactly as you predicted in your book, about this. You wrote, by the way, one of the great books on money that I've ever read. It's just fantastic. But it was like a nightmare scenario. It was like the greatest head fake in the history of economics. Here's all your money. Whoops, it's gone. Right? But it socialized an entire generation into the idea that everything is fake. That I can get rich by staying at home as long as I comply. And it seemed as if there's this magic prosperity machine that's just running all the time. And nobody believed anymore that there was a connection between what you do and the money you make. Like a whole generation was raised with this idea that it's all just gibberish, that there's powerful people. They give me money if they want. They take it away when they want. And it has nothing to do with me. And that's a whole generation believes this. I was talking to a waitress one time when I was in Miami, and I said, "Well, how's business and that sort of thing?" And she said, "Well, it's pretty good. Some people tip a lot, some people tip a little bit, but I've realized something that is all nonsense. There's infinite amounts of money. It's just a matter of playing your cards right, then you can grab it." I said, "What do you mean infinite amounts of money?" "Oh yeah, they just print it. They just print what they need. All this, it's fake. Everything is fake. The whole world is fake." That's what she said to me. It's like, wow, baby, you got problems.
Yeah. Here's the thing. This is probably part of the sea change. That scares the crap out of me. And it scared the crap out of me 15 years ago or 20 years ago when we started a campaign to understand what money printing was doing to the purchasing power and like putting all the pieces together and how that leads to the national debt and all that. We've been working on that project for a long time. And that scares me. But the fact that people just think that that's the way it works is even more scary because there's no kind of root connection. I remember one piece that Bill Bonner wrote that I love, but it's really hard to articulate to people if they don't understand what you're talking about. He wrote a piece, and the headline was called "Deracinization," and he had to explain what that meant. It means you lose your roots, like you lose your connection to the land, basically. Like your labor doesn't translate into the economic position you find yourself in anymore. And then we that led to a whole theme of critique of Wall Street, where they're just flipping money, flipping paper contracts back and forth. The whole options, there's $117 trillion out there in options on any given trading day, and those are just paper contracts that are traded back and forth. There's no production value behind that. I mean, that's a whole rabbit hole in and of itself, but that's what we see your waitress who is like, yeah, whatever, give me a tip or don't, it doesn't matter to me. This is just the way life is anymore.
Yeah, no, everything's fake and it doesn't matter. A lot of this began after 2008, I think, after Bernanke's zero interest rate policies. Because there's no such thing as zero interest rates, but they forced them on us anyway. And that massively distorted the production structure, caused an explosion in the media and big tech and all the large corporations that they had unlimited access to capital at very cheap rates. And so there's no limit to the amount of people they could hire. So if you show up with the right credential, you got, $250,000, even though you did absolutely nothing. And there was no check on the growth of these companies because money was so cheap. And then you had the lockdowns. I mean, what's his name? Powell's trying to unravel this. Then the lockdowns happen, slam back to zero. And then these same people, making $250,000, six figures in any case, suddenly, got to sit at home for 12 months doing absolutely nothing. And making not only their salary, but then also stimulus payments. I mean, it's like, you can't do that to a whole generation and have them think logically anymore. It was like brain poison for a whole culture.
Well, back to the blueprint idea, that's also the blueprint for universal basic income, which has been a political objective of Cloward Piven, for example. That was one of the things that they wanted to achieve by overwhelming the welfare state. They wanted that. Then once the welfare state was overwhelmed, then there would be a lot of people that were kind of left high and dry without any way to support themselves, and that would emotionally motivate people to support the government just giving people money in order to survive. I mean, that is a stated objective of a lot of people in the progressive movement, that we can print our own money, so we should just be giving it to a lot of people. And I think it got lip service for decades. It started to get codified during the Clinton administration when they passed laws on welfare and work and those kinds of things. But nobody thought the government would actually start giving out money. And now we have a blueprint how it can happen. And once you open that bag, or that box, that's a Pandora's box, right? Like anything can happen. So now we have precedent.
Yeah. So something like what, 5, 6, 7, 8 trillion, maybe $10 trillion was spent during that period. Again, 7, 8, 9 trillion of that was purchased by the Federal Reserve. The debt was bought. So it was like this magic prosperity that happened. It was just out of nowhere. Then it was all stolen through inflation. But the stealing is a little more opaque. It annoys people, but they're not. I wouldn't say the average person understands the relationship between the stimulus payments they got in 2020 and 2021 and the wild inflation we've seen since that time. I don't think that's very obvious to people. And yet it's obvious to us. I mean, it's the whole history of bad government, essentially. Spending too much and then inflating your way out of the debt. That's exactly what happened. It's unbelievable.
Well, it's on overdrive right now, too. That's why I think that this election year is going to be really interesting because, like kids who are used to getting their way, there's going to be a lot of people stamping their feet next year on both sides.
Yeah, there's no way it's going to be contested at every level, right? I mean, no matter who wins, half the country is going to think it's a fake president. I don't know. One wonders about the future of democracy. I really do. I had an old friend of mine, Eric von Knut-Ledeen. He was a dedicated, I don't know if you know that name, but he was a very interesting guy, good friend of Bill Buckley's, but he was a monarchist. He never believed in democracy. And he used to always tell me, this democracy stuff's not long for the world. It's going away. It's unworkable. It's either going to end in anarchy or totalitarianism, but democracy doesn't work. And I never wanted to be that guy because I'm a strong sort of believer in Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and that kind of stuff. But I'm worried these days. I really am.
Well, I think we get anarchy first, then we get totalitarianism. That's a sort of the historical trend of empires. I've been reading Ray Dalio's book, Principles of Changing World Order. It's very, very good. And I recommend it to anyone who's listening because he does something that I wish I had thought of when we're putting Empire of Death together. He breaks it down. So he's written an entire narrative, and it's a study of empires throughout history and how they rise and fall and like cycles that they go through and money printing and taxation and all that kind of stuff. He's done historical look going all the way back to pre-Roman times. And it's really interesting, but the way he presents it is even better because what he does is he highlights the key points. So even though it's written in narrative format, like you could go through, I read like 1,000 pages long, right? And I read the first half of the book in one night because I'm like, okay, I'm going to commit to just looking at the highlights. And it reads like a narrative, even if you're just looking at the highlights. But his assessment is that we're at the late stage of the collapse, and excessive money printing, military adventurism, just divisiveness in politics. Those are all hallmarks of the late stage, the collapse of any empire, whether we consider ourselves a republic still or not.
Sure. That has to be true. That has to be true. I mean, you trace it back. I mean, the British Empire preceded us. Before that, it was the Habsburg Empire, then the Holy Roman Empire, and then the Portuguese Empire and the Spanish Empire. And then you roll that back to the Roman Empire. But in the New World, we had our own stories, right? I mean, the Mayans became the great, kings of the Americas, and then they were replaced by the Aztecs. Then the Aztecs were overthrown by the Spanish. But yeah. And every one of these stories, it's the same thing. Too much expanse, money printing, decadence, leading to the rise of a stupid generation or several that squanders all the advances and ways and then gets conquered by somebody else. So, that seems to be the story. And it's a little strange, isn't it, to know that that's us, after 1989, we thought, what is that line that everybody in Washington was using? They still use it. The indispensable. Well, there was that, right? Which I believed. Unfortunately, I didn't know I believed it, but I definitely believed it. But then after that, they started calling America the indispensable nation. Well, really? Really? No other nation is indispensable, just America? I think we're going to find out otherwise here pretty soon.
Well, Jeffrey, I want to ask you one more question because I just enjoyed the time that we worked together. You used to come to Baltimore and you would sit in my office and type away at whatever you were working on, and you were exploring and trying to explain the meaning of Bitcoin back in 2009.
Right.
And specifically, I remember you were trying to explain to me why it was important. And I had just published Demise of the Dollar. So I was critiquing the fiat currency system, and you were like, don't you see that this is the solution to all of the problems with the fiat system that you articulate in your book? Don't you see that this is true? And I'm like, yeah, well, I don't know. It's a technology that I don't understand, so I don't really trust technology in the way that a lot of people do. I remember arguing with you, like, it can't be as good as you make it out to be.
Yeah.
And you said that one day, you're like, okay, I'm going to buy you a Bitcoin, and you created a wallet for me. You bought one Bitcoin, and I literally think it was like 73 cents at the time or something like that. And you gave it to me. And so it was like in my archive of emails. I never found that. I still haven't found that Bitcoin, but you bought me one for 73 cents. And I remember thinking about it. I wrote about it actually in like 2016. It was like, whatever, $48,000 on the day that I was writing. Oh, Jeffrey.
Yeah.
So what was your thinking on Bitcoin evolved since 2009?
Yeah, so this is a much deeper conversation. Maybe we can have some other time, but sometime around 2013, 2014, everything changed in the Bitcoin world. So you're right. I think both of our intuitions were right. I think I was right that it was a miraculous technology and had a lot of potential. But you're also right, there was something that didn't seem quite right about it. Everything changed once they started restricting the block size. So by 2015, remember when I sent it to you, it was instant and fast, and I was always going on about that. Like, hey, Addison, look, I can give you money instantly with no fees. And you're like, wow, okay. Well, that wasn't true. By 2015, it became very slow, very expensive to send. And that was because of the restriction of the block size. The developers throttled Bitcoin, so it can never compete with Bitcoin with credit cards. And in those days, 2014, 2015, a lot of people were adopting Bitcoin as a payment system. You remember that? And then they stopped.
Yes.
This is why they stopped, because it was not able to scale to a global marketplace. And I have an introduction to a new book coming out on this topic. And basically, it's about the betrayal of Bitcoin. And I think that's essentially what happened. Now, does that mean that eventually, long term, it's doomed? I don't think so. I think there's probably is some future to it. But I talk to you about it as a money. That's not the way people talk about it anymore. Now they talk about it as a kind of a reserve currency, the way gold worked under Bretton Woods. And that's really a different conception of Bitcoin than you and I had in the old days. There's something dramatically changed. And a cynic
what do you think?
This is the deep state, working to subvert it. I mean, maybe, I don't know, but something happened. It was a different thing. And from your own study of money, nothing can ever become a money unless it's in common use, in real use, in commerce. Bitcoin is not really grown in terms of its everyday use. And there's a reason for that. So is that a setback, or does it doom Bitcoin forever? I'm guessing it's a setback slightly, because now we have this thing called the Lightning Network, but Lightning Network has a lot in common with a mediated trust-based institution. So it's not quite what Satoshi imagined. So things have really changed a lot. The other thing that annoys me is that when you and I talk about Bitcoin, we were idealists. We were talking about like, oh, this is the great new money that's going to enable freedom for the world, right? That's not the way people talk about Bitcoin anymore. Now they talk about it like this is a great investment scheme. Let's buy a lot of it and watch it go up. That's different.
Yeah, it's an object of speculation. It's coming back around right now because I think the last time I looked, it was around 37,000. And it had dropped all the way down to right before the pandemic. It dropped to 6,000 or something like that. So there's a lot of people that made money all over again. But the only way to make money, it's just like with gold. The only way to make money that you spend is to convert it back into U.S. dollars. It's not really an alternative. It's an investment tool,
Yeah,
or a
and
speculative tool. It's not really
yeah,
investment. Unless you believe that it's $1 million, like Michael Saylor had said.
yeah. It's disappointed everybody in that sense. I think by now it was supposed to be $1 million, right? At least I believe that in the old days. And now you convert it back to dollars, and you're going to be harassed by your bank, and you're going to have to pay very high taxes on it. Same as you would with selling of a stock. So it's not an easy thing to get into and out of. I don't see how it becomes a replacement for fiat currency. I just don't see that scenario really. To me, it's really a story of tragedy. That's something that could have become a mainstream money for the world, just was gradually mutated into just another investment scheme. And I don't like that. It's disappointed me, I would say.
Well, it inspired too the idea of the central bank digital currency, which isn't a cryptocurrency, but the idea that you can take advantage of the efficiencies that blockchain does offer.
Yeah.
Then it just puts another tool in the hands of the Fed.
Yeah.
They come up with. I have my reservations about that. There's a lot of people in our space that would say that central bank digital currency is going to give greater control to the government on your buying decisions. There's a lot of fear that even some of the themes within government that we've been discussing today will take hold, and they will actually be able to use your money against you, or just take it away if they're spending it on. Really, I'm just getting your opinion on this. I don't think that it's going to be adopted that quickly. There's a lot of people that don't even use the banking system. They still use paper dollars to pay workers, or there's still millions, 100 million people that are outside of the digital world.
Yeah, there's
just in the U.S.
Yeah, with 25% of the population, is it 25% don't have, or is probably larger, don't have bank accounts at all? So I don't see a central bank digital currency is coming along right away, but they're also playing a long game, right? So we may be talking 5 or 10 years from now. And my guess is the way it comes about is that, have you noticed more and more people are getting their bank accounts shut down for reasons they can't explain, and they're having to move their money around? So in the same way that you have trusted travelers, and we have our driver's license now, you have to get your driver's license renewed in order to board a plane and this kind of stuff. It could be that you will have your bank accounts become subject to the same sort of thing. If you're tired of getting your bank account deleted, if you want absolute assurance that your bank won't delete this, then you have to comply with the following things. And through that mechanism, they will tighten and tighten and tighten the regulations. There definitely is an ambition to create a programmable money that would recreate something like a Chinese style social credit system. But it's going to be a tough time getting from here to there. That's for sure. Especially now that nobody trusts the system at all anymore. I have, by the way, friends of mine who live entirely off Bitcoin. They don't have banks. This is still going on. So who knows? I don't know how they do it, but they do it.
All right. In 20 seconds, give me your elevator speech on liberty or lockdown.
Yeah. So this is my August 2020 screed, and actually it holds up really well. I was furious. The world changed, and I wrote out all my thoughts on every detail of how lockdowns happened and what was wrong with it. So the reason I keep it up in print is that it still holds up, and I still stand by every word of it. Like you, Addison, I believe something fundamentally changed in the matrix in March 2020, and we're still not dug out of it yet. And we still don't entirely understand how or why it happened to us. but it's the struggle of our lifetime. So I think my book is important for that. And my institute, Brownstone, is really wholly dedicated to figuring this out. That's all. That's all we do. We just try to figure it out every day and every way.
So if readers want to go to Brownstone Institute, it's pretty straight up, right? Where do they go?
Yeah, brownstone.org, brownstone.org, and sign up for the email list. We send one email a week. I've learned that seems to be most effective. And it's a deep dive into all of this mess that we're experiencing right now. And I've got a lot of
one email a week, but there's a lot of stuff in there.
Stuff in there. Yeah. It's so good.
All right, Jeffrey. Yeah, it's great to talk to you. And we should do it again soon. So I'll stay in touch and we'll talk again soon.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Addison.